Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, everybody, wherever you are on this magnificent planet we share. My name's Tim Hollow. I'm the Executive Director of the Green Institute, which is the think tank of the Australian Greens, as well as a co-founding co-convener of this Global Greens Strengthening Democracy Network. And it's such a pleasure and privilege to be launching the network with you all today. Before we proceed with the launch and I introduce our three incredible speakers and Greens leaders, Marama Davidson, Frank Habineza and Elizabeth May, a few essentials. Firstly, we do have translation available, as hopefully you can see in the chat. The main option is live interpreting into Spanish by fantastic Global Greens volunteers Toby and Armando. You can tune into their channel by clicking on the interpretation button with a little globe icon at the bottom of your screen and choosing Spanish. For other languages, we have a second best option with apologies. At the bottom of the screen also, you'll see a CC Show Captions button. You can click that and set a language. It's imperfect, but it does work surprisingly well to give you translated captions in a wide range of languages. Next, we will be leaving time after the presentations for questions and discussion, noting that there are over 200 people registered and we do need to stick to our 1 hour time. We won't, of course, be able to get to everything, but please type any questions you have into the Q&A or chat box as we go, sticking, of course, I remind you, to Green's principles of thoughtful and constructive language. And I will do my best to bring as many of them as possible to the panel. Finally, I want to acknowledge, as is important cultural practice here in Australia, that I am chairing this event tonight from the unceded lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, who have stewarded the land that I live on, now known as Canberra, for countless millennia. I pay respect to elders, past and present, and recognise how central decolonisation is to our work as Greens. And at the core of that, how much all of us all around the world have to learn from First Nations deep democratic practices. And that leads me to why we founded this Global Greens Strengthening Democracy Network. We Greens have always been about deepening democracy. In Australia, Germany, Aotearoa, New Zealand, everywhere where we have arisen, key figures like Bob Brown and Petra Kelly have seen that our existing political systems are actually part of the problem. And while we have to operate within them, we also have to recognise that they exist structurally to maintain systems of power that drive ecological destruction, economic inequality, and social injustice. Our task as Greens has never been simply to take power, but to transform power, to take weak, incomplete, corrupted or non-existent democracies and create true, deep democracy. That task is both the same and radically different in different parts of the world. And to me, the great gift of the Global Greens is how it enables us to connect with others from our movement, working to achieve the same things in radically different circumstances, to share our experiences, challenge ourselves to think differently, and learn from each other and our experiences. I always find it slightly terrifying, for example, that people I speak to in Greens parties around the world look to Australia as such a bastion of democracy and are deeply envious of our political system. To us here in Australia, our experience is that those with economic and political power abuse it terribly and use our superficially healthy democracy, our healthy electoral system, as cover for rampant and deeply unpopular ecological, social, and economic destruction. I've become increasingly of the opinion that democracy is a great idea that we're still in the very early stages of getting back to after a few centuries or millennia of diversion. Indeed, as I said at a recent Global Greens webinar, the enormous popular demand for emergency climate action set against the stark refusal of almost any government almost anywhere to act even close to matching the scale of the threat, exposes all our governing systems, whether we consider them strong democracies or flawed or weak or not democracies at all, as failures. This is the little task this network sets ourselves, hosting and stimulating conversations around the Greens globally to discuss the democratic challenges we face, from cultivating democracy where it barely exists to facing down autocratic challenges where it has been strong, from confronting corruption to deepening participation, from relocalizing decision-making to sowing the seeds of true global democracy. We're here to forge supportive links across continents and to challenge all of us to think more deeply, more transformatively in our work. In launching the network, I want to thank and acknowledge our co-founders and co-conveners. This network really started with conversations in Incheon last year between myself, Beate Bjørsvik from the Norwegian Greens, and Robina Nanyunja from the Ugandan Greens. And they are two of our co-conveners, alongside Mohammed Awad from the Egyptian Greens, Suresh Nautiyal from the Indian Greens, and Lois Maldonado from the Venezuelan Greens. I also want to recognise the hugely important participation of Norbert da Costa and Alison Lamb from the Canadian Greens, and of course Frank Sheridan from the Global Greens. We're hard at work alongside our other jobs to bring you lots of engagement, but I really want to invite you now, as you listen to today's discussion, to think about how you might get involved in helping get our work off the ground. Now, we have three brilliant Green leaders from around the world with deep expertise and experience in democratic practice who've generously given their time to help us launch the network by reflecting on some of the key issues. And it's now my great pleasure to introduce them one by one. We're going to go in time zone order from late at night in Aotearoa in New Zealand through Africa to early morning in Canada. And now I want to introduce the Honourable Marama Davidson, who was elected to Parliament in 2015 and in 2018 became co-leader of the Green Party of Aotearoa, New Zealand. From 2020 to 2023, Marama was Minister for the Prevention of Family Violence and Sexual Violence and Associate Housing Minister in a Labor-led government. Marama's background in political activism and human rights work is the foundation of her position as an outspoken parliamentary advocate for Indigenous leadership. Marama is of Ngāti Porou, Ngāpuhi and Tirarawa descent. She lives in Tamaki, Makoro, Auckland, and has 6 children and 3 grandchildren, and is a tremendous political leader. Marama, over to you.
Kia ora, Tim. I'm so impressed with getting your tongue around our native language. Thank you very much. Kia ora koutou katoa. Greetings from Wellington. I'm actually here in my Parliament office in Aotearoa, New Zealand. I've just seen on the chat thread that our newest Green MP, Francisco Hernandez, is on the call. Fran, you can definitely also go to bed, my friend. It's late here in Aotearoa. We are 10 past 11 p.m. I'm so rapt to have this discussion, and I want to launch straight into it because I know we have limited time. Really keen to get into kōrero discussion. Firstly, because we are, and I am looking particularly at the role of Indigenous leadership and the intersection with global democracy, I also want to acknowledge where you are, Tim, and the peoples who have always maintained sovereignty, the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri people, if I'm correct in listening to you. My peoples, as Tim has said, are the Ngāpuhi, Te Rarawa, Iwi. They're the tribes in the north of Auckland, the north of New Zealand, and on the east coast, my people, my mother's people, are called the Ngāti Porou people. And it is from the Indigenous worldview, my privilege at being able to be raised in and on my Indigenous homelands. That is not a privilege that Indigenous people in Aotearoa often have. And my politics being grounded in Te Ao Māori or Indigenous Māori thinking. One of the biggest challenges we are facing today, just to put into context, the Green Party of Aotearoa New Zealand have just come through an election in October 2023, having gained the most historic electoral success ever. We are currently 15 MPs, our largest caucus ever to be achieved. In that, we have the largest ever Māori and Pacific caucus we have ever had. We have our first Vietnamese descent MP, Francisco, who is here on the chat, and only was sworn in on Tuesday, is the Greens' first ever Filipino MP. We also have the Greens' first ever Mexican descent MP. We are proud of starting to actually look like what our country looks like, and represent what our country looks like. New Zealand has a founding document, an agreement with Indigenous peoples and the Crown called Te Tiriti o Waitangi, the Treaty of Waitangi, which was signed at Waitangi and all around the country. Every single day since it was signed, it has been breached. The treaty essentially upheld the sovereignty, the independence, the mana motuhake, the self-determination of Indigenous peoples over our lands and resources, our treasures. That is being breached every single day. But we, over the past few decades and generations, finally started to see Māori, Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people working together to protect our planet and to ensure just distribution of resources across communities. This current government is one of the most anti-democratic, anti-tiriti, and therefore anti-Māori, anti-environment governments that this country has ever seen. A particular example is right now and in the House today, and constantly for the past months, I have been taking the Prime Minister to task in oral question time on some fast-track legislation that is before us. It concentrates unprecedented power for fast-track proposals, projects the likes that include coal mining, oil drilling, seabed mining, into the hands of 3 ministers, unprecedented power, and none of those ministers include any conservation minister, any environment minister, any treaty minister, and it's absolutely going to open up our communities, our seas, our waters, our lands to fossil fuel extraction and production. The Green Party are fighting this with everything we have got, asking questions in the House, rallying submissions before our select committee, supporting the communities and grassroots leadership who are mobilising, getting media and presence and cut through and narrative wherever we possibly can, and forming relationships with civil society, iwi, Māori Indigenous groups, and grassroots activists. My last comments, strengthening democracy is something in New Zealand that has been a conversation that we have been trying to have for quite some time under constitutional transformation. And constitutional transformation in Aotearoa has particularly been led by Māori leaders with the community discussion over many years to be able to work out how can we live together, non-Māori, non-Indigenous, and Māori Indigenous, in a way that upholds our unique status as Indigenous peoples and our independence and self-determination, that upholds the integrity of everyone who comes here and lives here, that protects our environment, that makes long-term what we call mokopuna as grandchildren, mokopuna decisions, 7 generations ahead decisions. And the sort of constitutional transformation that we are trying to forge for quite some time now gets to the point that you were raising in the start, Tim, which is to actually disrupt and overturn the current status of power and the system of power that concentrates the status quo, that protects the status quo of inequitable wealth built on the back of destruction of people and the planet and held in the hands of a few. And constitutional transformation would instead help to create a circular economy as other people know it. You might all be thinking of Kate Raworth and her donut economy. In Indigenous peoples, that is simply the economy. Circular, regenerative, restorative, and connected to whakapapa or our genealogy, Our mountains are our ancestors. Our rivers are our ancestors. How do we protect her? How do we protect our grandfather mountain? I'm going to end there. I've got examples coming out my ears of what that looks like on the ground, for example, saving wetlands. But I would like to honour the time, and perhaps we might come back through some of the discussion. Kia ora.
Thank you so much, Marama. Wonderful, and such crucial insights, both on the limits of our democratic system as it exists and how we work as Greens to and you as First Nations people to deepen it. And yes, we will definitely come back in the discussion. I now have the great pleasure to introduce Dr. Frank Habineza, who I'm sure many of you know or know of, is an environmentalist, human rights, democracy and defence and security expert who graduated from the National University of Rwanda in 2005 with a BA in Public Administration, has a Master of Science from the Swedish Defence University and an Honorary Doctorate of Humanities due to his work in democracy and human rights from Bethel College, Indiana in the USA. Frank is a member of the Rwandan Parliament since September 2018 and Vice President of the Social Affairs Committee. He was presidential candidate in the 2017 Rwanda elections, representing the Democratic Green Party of Rwanda, and is an aspiring presidential candidate in the coming July 2024 general elections. With an extensive history in civil society, journalism, environment, NGOs, and much more, Frank has also, of course, been heavily involved in the African Greens Federation and the Global Greens. Frank, such a pleasure to have you. Thank you so much for joining us. Over to you.
Thank you very much, and it's such a good pleasure for me to join this wonderful panel. And I apologize for delaying to join in. I was still in a parliamentary meeting, and we shall join again in 40 minutes. So I'll try to start our conversation. I'm glad to hear from you. Indeed, it's our journey of starting the Democratic Green Party of Rwanda was such a hard one. But first of all, I would like to thank all our friends from the Global Greens who stood with us in difficult times. Specifically, I cannot forget Senator Bob Brown from Australia and all the Australian Greens, our friends from Canada, Elizabeth May, and from Europe, the European Greens, and from Africa. They stood with us. So we started the journey in 2009 when we launched the Democratic Green Party, an opposition party, where we had kind of a one-party state, though we had political parties, but at the time it was very difficult because the political parties there, which were inherited from the time before the 1994 genocide, they were on the coalition government, or the ring coalition. And so no party would stand up to say anything that is going wrong. So we stood up and said that we could not believe what was happening, that we wanted to have a freedom of speech, freedom of expression, even the right to protect the environment. You cannot have it if you cannot have freedom to express yourself. So when we launched the party in 2009, we were beaten physically. Our Congress was confronted violently with people with guns. Our people were arrested, and some even ran out of the country. And in 2010, my deputy president, Andrew Kagwari Sirika, was killed, beheaded. It was a very, very violent attack, whereby we found his body decapitated. And such events were so terrible that I had even to run to exile, where I went to Sweden. And I stayed there for 2 years, and other people ran to America, to Europe, and East Africa, and so on. So it was such a very difficult time, but we kept the spirit alive, and our friends from all over the world kept on requesting the Rwandan government to allow our Democratic Party to be formed. And with support from our friends, as I mentioned, from Bob Brown and others. And we arranged again that I could be able to come back. We even had a lawyer from Australia. And even Australian Greens helped me to attend the CHOGM in Perth. That was in 2011. The CHOGM is, for those who don't know, is the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, which is chaired by the Queen, now by the King. So it brings all the countries together. So that was the first time the Rwandan government attended, which we had opposed because we believed that they had not been respecting human rights. So we opposed that in Perth, and we had people, demonstrations and so on, and I had a chance to have almost daily shows on the Australian Broadcasting Services, the ABC and the SBC, that's the also television and other newspapers. So we had a big show, and finally we had attention from the Rwandan government, and we had Senator Scott, I think from Western Australia, who also intervened, and many others. So basically, to cut it short, we put much pressure on the government. I was able to come back, but I came back with no guarantees, no nothing. And so my coming back from exile was also a sacrifice, because I knew that I would be put in prison, or I could even die anyway. But I believe that I had not committed any crime to start a party, and I believe that I had not done anything wrong. So I came back and confronted the system until we got registered in 2013 in August, so which took us 4 years for the party to be registered. So it's such a long journey. We kept the spirit alive, we kept pushing until we were able to go in 2017 presidential elections, which was a very good show for us to show our manifesto, our ideas. And in 2018, we also participated in the parliamentary elections, and then we became the first opposition party or new party to enter parliament after almost over 20 years. So we got 2 seats in the parliament, that was 5%. And a year later, we got a seat in the Senate. So we have now 3 parliamentarians, 1 senator, and 2 MPs. So that was a big achievement. We kept on rebuilding the party, gathering the international support. Now we've been able to build their party structures. We have a national youth greens, starting from the district level, provincial level, and national level. So we have a national youth green league and a national women green league, all structures established. So I would say that our party is now a strong party, and we have a very big voice in Rwanda, whereby people say that we are the second party because we are very big, we are very clear in our statements and in the media. And yeah, we are the only party after the ruling party that has all the structures, and that's visible. So as Tim mentioned, I'm also still running again for president in July this year. And I'm so hoping that we'll be able to achieve much more. So it's been such a difficult process, and but we could not have achieved that without the support of the global Greens and the international community at large. So yeah, what else I would say is that there's a big thing that we could say that when we drafted our manifesto in 2017 and 2018, it had a lot of challenging things to the government, but gladly, as I speak of now, 70% of our manifesto has been accepted by the government. Almost all the key points that we campaigned for, like land reforms, reducing of taxation, and the government has accepted. They've brought new bills. We also campaigned in education. For example, I would give a good example that at a time in Rwanda, children would go to school and would eat nothing the whole day. So we say that if we got elected, we would provide a hot meal to the children or students at school. And finally, the government brought in a new bill now, school feeding program. People can eat at school, whether private schools or government schools now. That's from our policy. We also campaigned for the increase of teachers' salaries, because the teachers were paid very less, and finally the government increased the teachers' salary for 66% for primary teachers and 44% for secondary teachers. We are still banging in for university lecturers, but at least that's a big achievement. We did a lot, even in agriculture, where there was a lot of monopoly, that the government was refusing people to plant any food in their gardens. We said this is not possible. You cannot enforce that. People could not just plant one thing or corn and then they have to go to buy it in the market. We said should allow people to have where they can have their own food, but also do others for commercial agriculture. So there have been some reforms, many, if I mention them, it take several hours, but I would say that 70% has been achieved, which is a good achievement. So we go back into elections now, at least showing that the Greens are not liars. If we promise something, we do it. This is a very big message, because people are used to politicians who promise things during elections time and they don't achieve it. And when you come back, people say, but you promised this, you never did. So at least now I'm very comfortable that I'll have a lot of things to show to the people that what I promised you, I've been able to achieve that. If you trust me again, we'll achieve much more. So with those brief remarks, I would like to stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Frank. Fabulous. What an extraordinary journey you have been on and continue to be on, and the achievements that you have managed to already score dwarf many of us in what people think of as mature democracies like Australia. If we Australian Greens could have implemented 70% of our manifesto, we would be delighted. And yeah, wonderful. We'll get into more in conversation, but now I want to also introduce Elizabeth May. Good early morning, Elizabeth. Elizabeth, many of you also will know, served as leader of the Green Party of Canada from 2006 to 2019, and again returned as leader since November 2022. She's the Green Party of Canada's first elected member of Parliament, representing Saanich Gulf Islands since 2011. In 2005, Elizabeth was made an Officer of the Order of Canada in recognition of her decades of leadership in the Canadian environment movement. She graduated from the Dalhousie Law School and was admitted to the bar in both Nova Scotia and Ontario. Practiced law with the Public Interest Advocacy Centre before becoming a senior policy advisor to the Federal Minister of Environment before then entering Parliament. And for 17 years, Elizabeth served as Executive Director of the Sierra Club of Canada. Thank you so much for making the time early in the morning to join us, Elizabeth. Over to you.
Well, first of all, it's just, it always reaffirms my deep commitment to the global green movement, to participate in any discussion with friends from around the world, because there aren't other political parties where someone could say, I've known, I mean, when I first, there's such an honor. And Marama, congratulations on the wonderful election results in New Zealand, and so much sympathy for what the country is going through now, and the enormous success in being one of the only Greens around the world that I can think of that was effectively part of a government with cabinet ministers, and including yourself, with Jacinda Ardern. And then usually if a senior part, the larger part of a coalition with Greens is being rejected, it usually hurts the Greens. That certainly has happened in Ireland. It's happened other places. I don't know, there may be another example where this is about democracy, so maybe there, I'm just relying on my memory, but I certainly don't know of another, doesn't come to mind, any global Green, any national Green party that has worked within a government that itself became unpopular and was rejected, where the Greens, as former members of that coalition, went on to have more success than ever at the polls. And your recent electoral success is extraordinary, and the diversity that you bring to this. And I wanted to, in line with what Marama said, I did want to start by saying that today finds me on, Canada is a very, very big country geographically, and we have literally hundreds of different Indigenous languages spoken in Canada by literally hundreds of different Indigenous nations. We generally categorize in groups of, there's large category of Indigenous peoples in this country are First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. I'm today outside of my normal territory. The name of my riding, Saanich Gulf Islands, and thank you, Tim, for the lovely introduction. I live and work on southern Vancouver Island, actually south of the US-Canadian border, for those who are interested in geography. It's kind of it, but I'm very southern tip of the islands, of the Vancouver Island itself, which was south of the Canada-US border, looking due east at Washington State in the United States. That territory, and the name of my electoral district, Saanich, is a mispronunciation of the traditional territory of Wasanic people, and the language spoken traditionally for thousands of years in that territory that I'm honored to represent in Parliament is a language called Senchothan, where the traditional greeting is Haishka, and the gesture of raising hands is one of honor. One of the chiefs told me that her grandfather had told her that it's raising your arms is to be like a tree. It's Haishka Haishka Siam, which is a greetings and thank you to everyone here. But this morning finds me, because I'm in Parliament today, I'm in Ottawa, thousands of kilometers from my traditional territory where I live and work. I'm on the traditional territory today of the Algonquin Anishinaabe peoples. So when we acknowledge territory, we're basically saying this is the stolen land of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people, and we say miigwech to them for the generosity and patience of us living on this territory, and the extent to which Greens in Canada try to be good allies is a big part of our work and the worldview we bring to it. And before moving on to talk more about what we have done with global democracy in Canada, I do want to also recognize my friend, Dr. Frank Habineza. When you brought us back to those memories, and it was gracious of you to thank us. I don't think we did nearly enough in Canada. We were so, being away, it was 2010 when Vice President was killed so brutally. And you were, of all of us, I have to say, so very brave. Because a lot of us put our, like what one might think of as normal life on hold, or expose ourselves to public humiliations, maybe. But certainly, you've risked your life for democracy and for the Green movement in Rwanda, and it's simply extraordinary how much has been achieved. Now, we'll do whatever we can from Canada to support you in the upcoming elections. What we did so far was, when you had to go into exile to be safe, and I remember we collected money and sent money, but goodness gracious, what you've done is so extraordinary and enormously brave. So to Marama's point about what we have to do as Greens in terms of representing some diversity, I'm obviously, I wish I had with me today I have two deputy leaders, but we're on our way to changing our constitution. The members will be deciding this, and I hope they'll agree with my current, and maybe I should put air quotes around it, because under our constitution, his actual title is deputy leader, but we actually function as if we were co-leaders, because we've been moved by, for instance, Marama's work as a co-leader with, and I know he's just left Parliament, with James Shaw, who's been a help and an inspiration to many of us around the world. We feel that, and so many, not every Green Party around the world, obviously not Rwanda, not Australia, but by my count, roughly a third of Greens around the world have either started with co-leaders or moved to co-leaders. It's obviously a very big advantage if you want to reflect diversity. It's very hard to do it, especially with the kind of North American, I think, unhealthy focus on leaders as opposed to movements. So when you get into an election time, they want to see the leader, the singular leader, and they want debates between leaders. And you think, well, okay, but we're a party that believes in grassroots democracy. It's one of our core global green values. So how does one person represent diversity? Well, fortunately for me right now, I'm very honored to work with an extraordinary young man. And the phrase someone saying, oh, well, he's so-and-so is so young, I'm old enough to be his mother. But it's usually said in sort of a hypothetical sense, but I am actually literally older than his mother, who's also a friend now since we've been working together. Jonathan Pegno is someone who comes from a different background from me in terms of his life's work. He's a Quebecer, so his first language is French. He speaks many, many languages because he's been in the human rights movement. He's worked all around the world with groups like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. He is also, not that we're into identity politics. I'm so grateful to know him. I don't care the color of his skin or anything. But it happens to help diversity that he is a young Black man and part of the gay community and Quebecer. He currently, this morning, we would find him if we could find him. He's in Norway for some other meetings and visits. But we are hoping, we have a special general meeting of our party coming up in late June, where the constitutional motion will be put to the membership. Do we want to move to co-leaders or not? I really hope we do. But speaking to the other point about the Indigenous worldview that Marama mentioned, is our deputy leader, which is under our current constitution, a leader, it has very, very, very few powers as appropriate in global Greens around the world. But there is the power, the ability, the authority to choose deputy leaders, and we're under our constitution we could choose 2. Well, as we move to co-leadership, we're hoping that Jonathan and I are hoping that the co-leadership unit of the 2 of us will continue to have the ability to appoint deputy leaders as we change the constitution. So the other current deputy leader is Indigenous, and her anglicized name is Angela Davidson. Her name that she's adopted from being an old growth forest land defender is Rainbow Eyes. She was just sentenced to 60 days in jail for being part of the largest action on civil disobedience in the history of Canada in trying to protect old growth forest on Vancouver Island, some of the very, very last of our ancient forests. So she's an extraordinary leader. Her first language is her Indigenous language, and she's very engaged in, well, all the work, as you can imagine, as being a deputy leader. We worked very closely together, but right now the singular focus is trying to appeal the jail term sentence that she received from the judge for nonviolent civil disobedience in trying to stop the logging of some of our last old growth. She speaks very clearly in terms of Mother Earth, and I'm very honored that she's once again serving. We had an interim leader who was fantastic, Amita Kuttner. Some of you may have known him, and he managed to persuade Rainbow Eyes from the place where she was at that moment in a very solid, basically encampment in an old growth forest in a place called Fairy Creek. And so it was Amita Kuttner, who's currently living in Scotland. Some of you may know him, but I'm very, very grateful that Amita convinced Rainbow Eyes to serve as deputy leader. And then when we had the leadership race and the transition where Jonathan and I then became in a leadership position, we reached out to Rainbow Eyes again, because I'm very firmly convinced that, at least for Canada, but I think the echoes are throughout the Global Greens, our purpose in democracy can't be in any way limited to the notion that one value out of 6 of ecological sustainability is the only thing we're working on. We're working for grassroots democracy, and we're working for Indigenous rights. And if we're not doing that, you can't do anything else. We're working for equity, for fairness, for an end to, I mean, I'll try this out on all of you because I'm among friends with Greens. So, it's not enough if you want to offset your carbon and you've just taken a big flight. It's common in Canada for people to say, well, I'll just go plant a tree. And I've decided we really need to talk about, you'd actually reduce a lot more carbon if you planted a billionaire. Now, I'll let that sink in for a moment. But as Global Greens, I'm also a pacifist. Obviously, I don't want to, hurt anyone. But I do think it would be only fair to them to reduce them from billionaires to mere millionaires. It's appropriate taxation. Let's eliminate the billionaire class. If we're going to have equity, if we're going to eliminate poverty, if we're going to meet any of these goals, then we have to turn our attention to the questions of why is it that the traditional colonial, extractivist, capitalist governments of the world are very comfortable with the idea that there's a 1% and then there's a 99%, and that there's a billionaire class that dictates the way the world will be. The status quo rules suit the billionaire class. The billionaire class, of course, is very comfortable with allowing what I regard as a form of global organized crime, which is the fossil fuel industry, to continue to threaten our survival. And again, to Marama's point of looking to the 7 generations, I'm also a grandmother. As I said, I'm old enough. I'm older than Jonathan's mother. Jonathan's just turning 34. My next birthday, I turn 70. I'm so angry. I'm so angry that, having worked on the climate crisis since 1986, and you mentioned, Tim, that I used to be in government. Well, my heavens, we had a chance to avoid the melting of the glaciers. We had a chance to avoid the warming of the seas. We had a chance to maintain something like a 350 part per million atmosphere of carbon. And here we are continuing to increase and expand. And we do recognize that as Canadian Greens, we're going into an election, by the way, in about a year and a half. There'll be a national election in late October of 2025 for Canada. We are now one of 5 parties in our national parliament. And we, like so many colleagues around the world, have the worst voting system of winner take all in first past the post. So like our friends in England, Greens of England and Wales and so on, we are struggling, and with the US, we are trying to bring in some form of fair voting and are inspired by the journey New Zealand has taken on that front. I'm going to end here and just say what an honor it is, and let's strengthen our global democracy network. So when people think about Greens, they think, oh yes, those people who work on climate, Indigenous rights, fairness, equity, and real democracy. Thank you. Miigwech, merci.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. Wonderful, reflections on a whole wide range of the democratic challenges that we face, and some of the amazing aspects of democracy that we bring as Greens to these questions. Grassroots democracy, challenging old questions of leadership through co-leadership models and all sorts of things. I want to bring Frank and Marama back to the conversation. I know, Frank, that you do need to go shortly back to your parliament as well. If I can ask for some quick reflections, there's a couple of questions in the Q&A already, which go to this in various different ways, about how, as Greens, we manage the contradiction, I guess, between operating within the system as it exists and trying to change the system. Right up top, we have a question from Paul about our commitment, for instance, not to take corporate donations, I think is the crux of that, and how that limits our capacity to work, but we stick to it on principle. So perhaps I might ask Frank first, if you have to go shortly, and then go around the panel to reflect on either specifically that donation question, or more broadly that juggle between the world as it is and the world as we would like it to be.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, what I think the first thing we do is to remain real, to remain who we are, because we try it. If we say we believe in participatory democracy, so we have to also be doing the same in our political parties, so that people see that indeed we are also democratic ourselves, and even in our parties. So when we tell them that you are not democratic, at least we show them by example. That's one. So we don't try to live double life, to be exemplary leaders ourselves. So if we mention what we promote, we do that also physically if you can. If you also talk about environmental protection, you do some small action of environmental protection. So this is the first thing, so to be real, to lead by example, and also to remain above the bar. Because if you say you condemn corruption, you should also not be corrupt yourself. So you cannot be taking bribes and then you condemn others for taking bribes. So we try not to accept donations from any person who is connected to anything bad. And we accept private donations from people who really do support us. Of course, in Rwanda, it's also difficult to get people to support you, because most of the people prefer to support the government, and some people fear to support the opposition because they think they will have trouble. So we don't have so many donations, or donors, but at least those who do support us, they are real, genuine. They support, especially our cause for democracy or for freedoms, or some other just interested in environmental protection. So I think they are genuine people, but they also come, they tell you that I'm giving you this small, maybe 1,000 francs or so, just because I believe in what you're doing and I support you. So that's what's very important here. And again, as I mentioned, that we have had chance to be in leadership positions, so we try wherever we are, as in Parliament or elsewhere, to lead by example and to stand for our values, not to change. Like for us who have stood the grounds, like when they brought a climate and a nuclear bill in Parliament, because Rwanda now is building a nuclear center here. We told them we don't believe in nuclear energy. So they brought the law in different formats through Vienna Convention, through what, until they brought a Russian agreement. So we stood the ground all the time, about 5 times. We said no, we voted for no, and we could give our reasons all the time. So they tried to threaten us, to intimidate us, to whatever. We could not withdraw. We stood the ground. So they could know that these people, this is a point they cannot change. So that what you believe in, whether you're intimidated or forced, will not change. So this is how we try to live in such tough environments within the system. But when they understand that this is your belief system, this is what you believe in, then sometimes they just say, okay, this one we know we cannot change him. Yeah. If it's something about unity and reconciliation, then there we shall agree, because unity and reconciliation for the country, that's we are together. But this is about democracy. If we fight it, we share that this one we don't agree. So maybe that's it in brief. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Frank. Can I pass that question to you, Marama, now?
Yes, I'll try and be clear and to the point. I really want to support you, Frank, and what you've just said. The Greens in Aotearoa, we also have a very clear donations policy and who we will accept donations from. So what we do is we target our fundraising, therefore, to be ethical, to really go and find the support from people who support our values, so that we do not have to compromise our values and our policies, and we are still able to fundraise money. There is no point in getting so much wealth to get into Parliament on wealth when you are no longer able to uphold your policies and your values against the current wealth distribution. And so it's a really fair question, Paul, and it is one that has been kicked around internally in our party quite a bit. But there is long-term thinking that the Greens are renowned for around the world, and it is a short-term track to also become hostage to a narrative that the only way to power is through big wealth. We're actually trying to change that. We're actually, in the Greens, we're actually trying to change our fundraising rules to even the playing field quite a bit, so that you cap donations, so that you are more transparent with the amount of donations that have to be declared and who parties are held hostage to. So I want to support Frank in that. And while I'm here, I'll quickly pick up the climate change, because Elizabeth, and kia ora to you, you picked up on this as well. There was a question in there about where does climate change action from Jenny sit on the priorities of each of the Greens represented. It's at the top, but it's not at the top alone or isolated. And that is the point, is that we cannot resolve climate action without resolving the economic system, without ending poverty, without making sure that we are upholding the rights of our Indigenous people, who often enough hold the key to climate action. So climate action is everything. Climate action is ending poverty. Climate action is ending violence against women and children. Climate action is ending homelessness. It's at the top, but it's not in isolation. Kia ora.
Thank you so much, and what a wonderful kind of green and ecological analysis. I see that as understanding that all of our work is entangled in a very ecological way. You cannot deal with the climate crisis unless you're also dealing with inequality and social justice. Elizabeth, the same question for you broadly on the balance between the world as it is and as it might be.
Well, we've had some success in Canada in changing the fundraising rules, particularly we have I think you probably know enough about Canada to know that we have provinces and the federal government as well. And Greens have been elected now in our federal parliament. So we have a caucus elected, despite first past the post, in the parliament nationally. But we also have elected Greens in legislatures in provinces. And it was the British Columbia Greens who brought in laws that changed British Columbia's fundraising system, which was what we used to call the Wild West, of no rules at all. We now have laws across Canada that make it illegal for any party to take money from a corporation. So we don't have to struggle with whether we should or not. It's not legal to take money in this country from any source other than Canadian citizens, and then only up to a certain limit per year. Now, we've also managed, in terms of how we make a difference, is we really believe in grassroots democracy. We exert that through the parliamentary systems where we're elected. And we've been successful in Canada so far in passing 2 pieces of legislation that have taken what's called in our system a private member's bill and made it the law of the land. We're on our way to our 3rd, which will confront environmental racism and put in place programs for environmental justice, dealing with issues like the disproportionate siting of toxic waste dumps and other abuses that are threatening human health and the environment that affect particularly racialized communities and Indigenous peoples. So that bill is now in our Senate. I put it in. Well, anyway, we're close to getting that one to be passed into law as well. The other 2 dealt with, one was it was a very strong piece of animal welfare legislation to ban the keeping of cetaceans in captivity, whales and dolphins and porpoises. And the other piece related to a spread of disease due to climate change, the spread of ticks that bear Lyme disease. So that was our first law that went from being a bill under my name to being a federal piece of legislation. So how do we balance? One thing about walking the talk is that we have a rule in our party against the leader of the party, what's called in our system, whipping the vote. The leader isn't allowed to say, you're going to all vote the way I vote, and I've decided this is how we're voting. It simply doesn't happen. So as leader, I can exhort my colleagues to vote the same way I'm going to vote. And equally, they can tell me this time we'd really like to all be voting the same way. Can we? Right now, there's just 2 of us in our parliament. But when there's more, we try to achieve consensus as a caucus, the way our rules around how we run our general meetings, or we strive for consensus. So in the same way that we don't want our voting system for the electoral system to be winner take all, we don't want top-down decision-making. We want to hear many, many voices and have to work for consensus in our parliament. We do that within the party as well. We're struggling. Of course, we're struggling. The first past the post system is awful, but we have Greens elected in New Brunswick and British Columbia and Ontario, where they just doubled the size of the caucus from 1 to 2 in a late November by-election. Wonderful success there, thanks to lots of volunteers who hit the doors in a riding called Kitchener Centre. So we're quite confident that in the next federal election, we will win far more seats. I should also mention Prince Edward Island is a province where for the first time, Greens recently were the official opposition. And so New Brunswick, PEI, Ontario, and British Columbia have strong elected Green caucuses. At the municipal level, I'm really inspired by what the Greens in England and Wales just did in local elections. We really should try to focus more on local elections, I think, but we do have a strong Green caucus in one of our largest cities, Vancouver, where their municipal politics allow them to actually have people running municipally with the party banner. So I just say that we don't compromise on our values ever, but we use the current unfair system in which we find ourselves to the maximum extent possible to use the parliamentary rules of procedure and to make the changes we want to see in our own government. I'd say our greatest failure is that our government is still subsidizing fossil fuels. And when a private sector pipeline company from Texas, this is the one time I ever got arrested, and I'm ready any time now, but anyway, the pipeline called the Trans Mountain Pipeline, when grassroots opposition and Indigenous people's opposition made this Texas-based company decide it was going to give up and move away from Canada and not try to build this expanded pipeline, our government, I'm still in shock, bought the pipeline and constructed it when the private sector walked away. So that's $34 billion of public dollars spent on an appalling project that will boost greenhouse gas emissions, has violated Indigenous rights along its long route from northern Alberta to the port of Vancouver. I'll stop there just to say that the greatest, our mission is to actually be trying to change the way society operates, which means, of course, we can't embrace unfair, elitist, colonialist values from or patriarchal values. There's a lot of adjectives for the horrors of the system in which we find ourselves. But our great joy, I think, I know our symbol as Greens around the world is the sunflower, but sometimes I think it should be the dandelion, because a dandelion will push its way through the concrete on any city street and show up and brighten anyone's day, because we're not ever going to give up. And we draw strength from each other in a global green family of colleagues like the ones you see this morning's panel. So many brave and extraordinary Greens from around the world. And I think of a friend. I'm honored to have worked with her, and I miss her so much. But the founder of the Green Party of Kenya, and when you think of Wangari Maathai, who was the first person to ever receive the Nobel Peace Prize for doing environmental work. I mean, I don't think individually, domestically, certainly in Canada, I know we don't do enough to celebrate the extraordinary people who have been part of the green movement globally from forever. And so, Tim, for Australia, we draw so much inspiration from Bob Brown, and who from our elders, the people who started this, from Petra Kelly in Germany, from others all around the world. And being on a panel with Frank, you can see how much inspiration we have from the Greens of Rwanda. I'll stop there and just say this is a great way to start my day, but I also have to get to Parliament. But thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, Marama, and Frank, who's had to depart. We are at the hour now, and I know it's just struck midnight in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So thank you for sticking with us, Marama, as well. It's been a fantastic conversation. Thank you, everyone all around the world, for joining us for this launch of the Global Greens Democracy Network. We have an email list for the network that you can register for on the Global Greens website. We'll pop that into the chat as well. Hopefully you will have all seen it. And we really want to keep the conversation going on there. So if you have other questions, we can circulate them to panelists as well if those who aren't on the list. Please, let's keep the conversation going, because this is a democratic party. It is just such a joy that we have a grassroots up federation of federations here in the Greens. Thank you all for being part of it. And the network is launched. Excellent. Thank you, everyone. Those who need to get to Parliament, those who need to get to bed. Been a wonderful event. Thank you.